Today I'm going to be talking about the virgin birth. Is this something that literally happened? Is it a historical event, or is it just some kind of mythology that was incorporated into the Christian gospel narratives? That's what I'm going to be addressing. This is something that I think this time of year many people are wondering about. They're asking questions about this because people are talking about it. It's Christmas time, and there's always that question like, did this actually happen? Now, for me, growing up as a Christian, there really was no question because this was something that I had to believe in order to be a Christian. That's what I thought, because I was like, well, it's in the creed, and the creed is pretty important, the Nicene Creed. So this is like the proclamation of faith and what we believe in. And so these are the pillars, and part of a creed is to believe that Jesus Christ was born of a virgin. And so, like I said, I just accepted it and I didn't question it. And this is just the way I thought it was. But then later on, as I started to change my mind about like pretty much everything I grew up believing in the Christian tradition, eventually this whole notion of the virgin birth came up, and I was like, okay, now I really have like a hard time believing that this is literal, because it's impossible, first of all. Second of all, what do we have to go by? And one of the things that I was always curious about, even as a Christian, was why is this only in two of the gospel narratives? It's not in Mark, which is the earliest gospel, and it's not in John. It's in Matthew and it's in Luke. And the stories of it in Matthew and in Luke contradict each other a little bit. There's some differences, and there's not this alignment that you would expect. And so when I looked into this, and then I realized that some scholars were saying that the virgin birth in the gospel narrative was a later addition, and here's why. And the other thing I was interested in was to find out that the notion of the virgin birth is not found in any of the other New Testament writings. So a lot of it was causing skepticism when I started to find these things out, and I started to approach this subject with an open mind that was willing to change. You see, before, I wasn't willing to change my mind because I was just totally indoctrinated from all the dogma from the time I was a kid, and I just couldn't question anything. You were just taught to have blind faith, accept it. This is what the pastor or the priest is saying, and their interpretation of the Holy Book is the one and only interpretation that you must trust in, or the church's interpretation, whatever, and that was that. But the next thing that happened for me was I started to look into ancient mythology, and what I found was that ancient mythology from the various traditions, but especially from the Greek and Roman world during that time, during the Greco-Roman period, had a lot of these different themes and symbols and archetypes in their mythology that was very much connected to these different stories that I was reading about in the Gospels. And this notion of a virgin birth was definitely one of those things. Now, what I'll say is that the virgin birth, if we want to consider it to be a myth that we find in other traditions, it's not so much like, okay, this exact version of the virgin birth that we find in the Christian tradition is something that we find in other traditions that came before Christianity, because you won't really find that anywhere as far as the details of the story goes. But what you will find is this similarity in the sense of a woman having some kind of divine encounter where she is impregnated from this divine intervention, and it's supernatural, and then she gives birth to a God-man, to some kind of divine figure. That is what you will find. That theme, that story, that narrative is something that you find in many of these other mythologies and these different traditions and cultures. Now, each story is unique, but this is something that keeps showing up, and this is definitely what we find in the Christian narrative of the birth of Jesus, and Mary being a virgin, and the Holy Spirit impregnating her, whatever the teaching is, whatever the doctrine is. Very, very similar. So I started picking up on that. And it's not just with this, it's not just with the virgin birth, it's with the notion of this God man, the divine figure, dying and then somehow coming back. And it's not in the sense always of, really the only time we find someone being crucified and then buried for 3 days and resurrecting out of the tomb is in the Christian myth, in the Christian narrative. But what we do find in other myths and other traditions is some kind of divine figure who works miracles, who does all these things that are very similar to what we find in the Christian stories. And then they die and then they come back. We find that. That's not something that is exclusive to Christianity and the Jesus story. So, and I encourage all of you to look into that and to study mythology and astrology and how it connects and the ancient world and all of that. It's very fascinating. But by this time, when I was seeing all these different patterns and parallels and connections, I was like, okay, there's something much more going on to this story. And what some of the scholars that I was listening to and reading were saying was that they believe that this myth, or whatever you want to call it, of the virgin birth, or the notion of the divine intervening and impregnating a woman that would give birth to some kind of divine figure, was probably something that whoever wrote the 4 canonical gospels, or I'm sorry, the 2 canonical gospels that include the virgin birth, Matthew and Luke, this was probably something that they ended up incorporating into their gospels because of the time period, in the Greco-Roman world, where you had all this Greek and Roman mythology. There were different myths during this time that included some kind of divine intervention, birth of a divine figure in the mythologies. And then there were also these characters who, these people, I'll say, who literally, they were on the earth, they're historical people that were believed to have had some kind of miraculous divine birth. Okay, so not necessarily born of a virgin, although there are some instances where this is the case, but the pattern, the theme of it was that whoever the person was, especially these people, I think Alexander the Great was one, I can't think of the others, but if they had some like amazing status and they were like, believed to have divine powers or something, there was this automatic assumption that, oh, this person can't be a mere mortal, or they have to have some kind of divinity, and this means they came from some kind of god, some kind of deity that impregnated a woman. So this was believed to be the case for different people during this time period. And so what I think is that whoever wrote these 2 gospels that include the virgin birth, I think that they added this was incorporated into their gospels to almost like show or prove that Jesus was also in this class, or he was on this level of divinity. If he was God in flesh, as the story goes, this would have to mean that he had some kind of virgin birth, because this is what all the different myths point to. And there's other people on the earth right now who apparently have had similar births of divine intervention and the miraculous birth where they are a God man. So Jesus has to have this in his story in order for him to be what we're saying and believing he is. And I think some scholars would agree with this. So yeah, that's eventually where I started to understand, or how I started to understand, why these 2 gospels, for whatever reason, had this ancient archetype or myth in their gospels, and why we don't find it anywhere else in the New Testament writings. For me, that just made the most sense. And so, but I didn't stop there, because then I got into the work of like Joseph Campbell and people like Carl Jung. And what I learned was that these myths aren't just meaningless stories about the stars. They're actually stories that have these deep spiritual truths to them, and it's almost like it's like hidden messages or hidden codes within these stories that have to do with symbols and these different archetypes and these different themes. But ultimately, what these myths are pointing to is the human experience and awakening to the divine nature of each and every being through the human form, through the human experience or the journey or whatever. And so when I started looking at the virgin birth from this perspective, and I started to see the connections with astrology, Virgo, and December 25th being the winter solstice, when apparently the sun, the winter solstice is the December 21st or whatever, and for 3 days it's at its lowest point. In the ancient times it was believed to be dead, but then it gives birth on December 25th, which is when it starts to bump up a little bit and it starts getting brighter and brighter from that point on, which that really starts the 22nd or the 21st, whenever it is. But in the ancient times, it appeared that for those 3 days, it was just kind of in the same place, although it wasn't. But by the 25th, that was when, it's starting to get brighter until you reach the spring equinox, and then flowers are blooming and everything is coming to life. And so there's a lot of that involved in these ancient myths, because for them, they would look up at the stars, they would see the constellations, and it's what created these stories for them. It's what gave them almost like these images. And we find this, like I said, in all over the different ancient writings and in the artwork. But anyway, so this is a big part of the virgin birth. I think a big part of this myth has to do with astrology. But it's not just astrology, because it's the Hermetic principle of as above, so below, as within, so without. So what the astrology is presenting, what it's revealing and all of that, is actually pointing to what happens within you when you start to awaken to your Christ consciousness. And when you awaken to your Christ consciousness, all of a sudden, your true nature, the light of who you are, starts to rise, just like the sun rises on December 25th. This is the birth of Christ consciousness. This is when it starts to rise, and then it hits Aries in the spring equinox, and that's when it hits the pineal gland. And when it hits the pineal gland, then all of a sudden, you experience this divine wisdom, this intuition, which comes from the right side of the brain. And if you read the myth, the story of the three wise men, which by the way, they were astrologers, they came from the east. And if you're looking north, they're following the North Star. If you're looking north, east is always to the right. And they were the three wise men. Again, this is the divine wisdom that comes from the right side when that pineal gland is activated and the Christ consciousness rises and the light is shining, and you're experiencing the truth of your nature, which is love. It's pure, unconditional love. With that love comes this divine wisdom from the right side. This is, you can sit here and interpret this story in many different ways, but for me, I'm not saying that this is the way it is and you have to interpret it this way and you've got to believe like this. No, you can interpret the story however you want to interpret the story. You can believe whatever you want. I'm just saying, for me, I think there's something to it. I know for a fact that these stories, these ancient spiritual texts, have a tremendous amount of influence from mythology, from these patterns and these archetypes that have been in existence from the beginning of time. And most of these have to do with the zodiac and all the different signs and astrology, because this is what they've been writing about, and this is how they've been forming their interpretations and perceptions of the human experience, again, since the beginning of time, for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And we find this in just about every single tradition. So you can literally sit here and look at the story and see these subtle connections with the astrology, but it doesn't end with the astrology, because again, the Hermetic principle, as above, so below. You've got this divine awareness that sits within you that is waiting to be born. And you've got the solar plexus, right? You've got all these energy centers. And what happens when you start to awaken, when you start to experience some kind of shift in your awareness, then the energy within you starts to rise. And the more you let go, the more you forgive, as Jesus taught in the stories, the more these energy centers open up, and it goes through the heart center, the heart chakra. The heart opens, you start to experience this infinite love, and you realize that love is not just an emotion or a feeling, it's actually who you are. But it doesn't end with that, because it keeps going through the different chakras until it reaches the crown chakra, and you have this expansion of consciousness, and you realize that separation is an illusion, all is one. And this goes back to the Hermetic principle of as above, so below, as within, so without. What you are perceiving to be your external world is just a reflection of your inner world. Why? Because all is one. Everything is reflecting whatever your inner state of being is. And that's why the message of Christ consciousness has to do with understanding that whatever you're putting out, whatever you're sowing, is actually, or I'll say it like this, whatever you're judging in another is something that you are judging yourself for, because you and the other, you and your neighbor, are fundamentally one. That's why Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. What you do unto others, you are doing to yourself. Judge not, or you will be judged. This is this awareness, this is this Christ consciousness of oneness, of the unity of being. So you start to see this, you start to pick up on this, and it changes the way you live, because it changes the way you see yourself first and foremost. And then it changes how you interact with people and how you show love and kindness and compassion and understanding and forgiveness and grace, because your true divine nature, which this is what all these stories are pointing to. And notice how, when I talked about this in a recent video, there's so many different stories and myths, and even like movies today, that have to do with these ancient myths. And the main theme of the story is the main character, the hero, has to remember who they really are. They have to remember their true nature. And when they remember their true nature, all of a sudden, they're empowered. They remember. And that's what awakening is all about. Awakening is about remembrance. Remembering that your true essence is soul, it's spirit, it's source. It's beyond this human form. It's beyond the ego. It's beyond space and time. It's divine. And that's what we come here to learn. That's what we incarnate to discover. We forget who we are. We fall asleep. That's part of this game. That's part of this curriculum of Earth School, only to remember and then to allow the truth of who we are to shine through our human form. And so the virgin birth is the birth of the divine awareness, the Christ consciousness within you. And it comes from this place of the virgin that is pure. That's why it says, Jesus says, the pure in heart shall see God. This place within you that's ready and it's receptive. That's where you can start to experience this profound inner shift, where you can start to awaken. And as you awaken, all of a sudden there's this divine potential that starts to rise. And then ultimately there's this expansion of consciousness. And like I said, you start to live from the unity of being, because that word love is pointing to ultimate reality, which is the unity of being. Love is the recognition and the celebration of what is pure oneness. So again, you can interpret this story however you want. I just think it's really fascinating and interesting to go down this rabbit hole of seeing all the mythological and astrological connections in this myth and in other myths that this particular myth was probably borrowing from a little bit. Again, the story is very specific. It's unique. I'm not saying that this particular story of the incarnation and the virgin birth and everything we read in the Jesus story is something that is exactly found in other myths and other traditions, because it's not. The stories are different, but the themes are the same. The archetypes are the same, because these archetypes are coming from the collective unconscious, as Carl Jung says. And Joseph Campbell talks about how He says dreams are private myths and myths are public dreams, something like that. So when you understand the subconscious mind, the collective unconscious, how that works with the projection, the expression, the manifestation of our thoughts and what happens in the dream state, all these things and these archetypes, these symbols, they're all connected. Why? Because everything is one. And this is something that Hermeticism reveals and points to, as I mentioned, the Hermetic principle. And this is something we see time and time again, because one of the main things about awakening is pattern recognition. When you experience true awakening, you start seeing that there's all these different cycles and patterns of this human experience, of this universe. And things come back around and around, because look at the earth, look at all these different things that are moving, and they have these, look at the 4 seasons and the cycles of the different planets and the earth and the sun and the moon. Like, everything is moving, everything is flowing, but it's following a very specific pattern. Okay, and this is just the reality of everything, and not just outside of us, but also within us. So you start to see this, and this brings more intuition, it brings more wisdom and more clarity, and it helps you walk in the light of life because you're more aware. And so, yeah, again, once you see this, it becomes very evident, it becomes very apparent. Mark Twain once said, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes." And this is exactly what I'm talking about. Look for how it rhymes in this particular story after studying all these other ancient myths, and I think you'll be amazed. But ultimately, like I said, the virgin birth is a symbol, it's a myth, it's archetype for the Christ consciousness being born within you. And it rises and it becomes this amazing experience of bliss and peace and love, which is not something that you can attain externally. It's something that is already within you, because it's something that you are. You've always been infinite love. You've always been divine. And this non-dual awareness, this Christ consciousness, is all about this. And it's about living from the heart center. It's about living from the soul instead of the ego. This is what we were designed for. And Christ is the ultimate archetype of the self. I think Carl Jung said something like that. And I think we can look at this story, at this myth, and see the full embodiment and expression of unconditional love, non-judgment in this character of Jesus Christ. And we don't just see it when we awaken. We don't just see it in one person, Jesus of Nazareth, who lived 2,000 years ago. No, we start to see it within us, hidden behind the layers of the ego and fear and programming and judgment and all these different things that we've been believing. We see past all of that stuff, and we see that same divine light, that love that is fundamentally the true nature of the Jesus character in the story, is the truth of who we are. The stories about us. The stories about who we really are. And once we see it within ourselves, then we can see it within other beings, and that's what leads us into walking in oneness, in the unity of being. So I think that's it for today. If you found this video helpful, informative, or insightful, please leave a thumbs up at the bottom of the screen, and be sure to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.